civilians by an American soldier has provoked outrage here and overseas. It's also provoked further scrutiny of Joint Base Lewis McChord, where the Army sergeant was reportedly based. Up next, we'll discuss the issue with Congressman Jim McDermott. Stay tuned.
Support for KUOW comes from Brooks Biddle Suzuki, serving Seattle since 1966. Featuring a full line of Suzuki cars, trucks, and SUVs, including the 2012 mid-sized sports sedan, the Kizashi. Exit 23 off 405 in Bothell. More info online at brooksbiddle.com.
41 degrees, mostly cloudy in Seattle. We're expecting clouds and showers the rest of today, the high sneaking up to 42. Clouds and rain tonight and tomorrow. Tonight's low 35. We're expecting a high tomorrow of 44. It's 12:20.
From KUOW 94.9 Seattle, I'm Ross Reynolds, and we're joined this afternoon by 7th District Congressman Jim McDermott. Jim McDermott serving his 12th term representing the 7th Congressional District, primarily Seattle. Jim is the senior member of the House Ways and Means Committee. That's the Congressional Tax Writing Panel. He's here to answer your questions at 206-543-5869. That's 206-543-KUOW. It's toll-free 800-289-5869. Or feel free to write to us, conversation at kuow.org. Shocking news this week from Afghanistan. A sergeant from Joint Base Lewis McChord accused of murdering at least 16 Afghan civilians. U.S. military officials themselves have been murdered while in secure facilities in Afghanistan. You've said we're sliding backwards on Afghanistan. Why is that?
Well, I think we were on a mission that was never going to be accomplished, and we pushed it about as far as we could, but ultimately the anti-foreigner attitude of the Afghans is now taking effect, and they're pushing back and pushing back and pushing back. And every time we make a mistake, they capitalize on it, whether it's burning Korans or it's killing Taliban and then urinating on the bodies, or all the things. There have been a whole series of things which just have been used to inflame the anti-foreigner attitude among the Afghans. And I really think that we're not, it's pretty clear that the government in Kabul doesn't have much to do with the 40 million Pashtuns who live down in the south. And you've got an ethnic split in that country that we're never going to bring together. And I think we've accomplished what we could. We tried. We gave them an opportunity, but it simply hasn't worked. And I think we've got to admit that and come back.
Well, your colleague, Adam Smith, says that this does not mean that we should precipitously withdraw. He says the U.S. still has national security interests in the region, and it's important to ensure a stable Afghan government. Do you agree with that?
It's been our goal for 11 years, and we have not accomplished it. You have to, at some point, take stock of what you've done. You had a surge. You brought a lot of troops in. We've lost people all over the place, and we have not accomplished it. It is clear that some of the training of the people the al-Qaeda people who ultimately attacked the United States came from Afghanistan, but it's very hard at this point for me to see why we should continue to sacrifice our troops and put them through these continuous rotations in and out of the country with no visible or no evidence that we are succeeding. If we could show some continued evidence of succeeding, that'd be one thing. But things are worse now than they were 2 years ago.
Well, there is a scheduled withdrawal. Do you think that should be speeded up?
Yes. I voted for the amendment that was previously in the Congress that said that you would provide money only for the purposes of an orderly withdrawal. And I really think that that's what we ought to be in the process of doing. You don't leave on Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock. You can't do that reasonably. That's not sensible. But there is a way to gradually pull yourself out, as we've already done in large measure in Iraq. We're not totally out of Iraq, but we've gradually taken ourselves out. We ought to be starting that process now and speeding it up.
What happens to the non-governmental organizations that are doing aid operations in Afghanistan if the United States were to begin a rapid pullout of that country?
It will depend on how they have related to the Afghan people. If they have related in a positive way, that the Afghan people see as positive for them, I think they're not in any more danger then than they are now. Because they're really outside the military perimeters when they're, running schools and running clinics and those kinds of things. And I believe that if you can do economic development, you can go into Afghanistan and be helpful to the Afghan people, but the military puts the mark of occupation of we are controlling what's happening here. And that's the thing that the Afghans are reacting so strongly against. You got to remember, they threw the British out twice in the 1800s. And the Russians failed with a massive effort in the early 60s. So you are now looking at us finding out the truth of the matter is that the Afghan population is not ready for what we are trying to push.
This latest accusation against a sergeant from Joint Base Lewis McChord is just the latest in a series of things. We talked yesterday to a reporter from Stars and Stripes. In 2010, they called that base the most troubled in the United States, and certainly the events of this week do not help out with that reputation. Do we need to take a closer look at what's going on at that facility?
Well, before you point fingers at the base, I think you have to recognize that's the base from which most of our people were going to Iraq and Afghanistan. The Stryker brigades have been rotated in and out of there on a regular basis. I've been down there when they left. I've been down there when they came back. I've seen, and you see these guys, and they're just been on a conveyor belt down there. And that base has had a different role than Fort Bliss in Texas or, 10 other places you could name. So I think that it's really, they are catching the flack for what's going on because they are also been catching the war in a heavier way than some other bases. So yes, we do need to look at it. And we need to look at how we treat people when they come back for post-traumatic stress disorder and for this total brain injury, the TBI that this young man is alleged to perhaps have had. We've been cavalier about that, or I shouldn't say cavalier. I don't think we've paid enough attention. I mean, I got into this whole business in politics in 1970, coming back from Vietnam. I was sitting there dealing with people for 2 years coming back from Vietnam. I've seen these kids.
You're a doctor, and you were dealing with them in a clinical fashion.
Yeah. Exactly. So I know what we're dealing with here, or at least I have some feeling for it. And it's easy to want to brush it off and say, pull yourself together and go on out there and do it again. But there's an increasing amount of evidence from what's going on in Afghanistan that there are some people beginning to break down. And the figure that I heard the other day, which really struck me, was there are 18 suicides in the United States military every single day. Now, these are young men and young women that we have asked to go out and defend us, and they've done an admirable job. But many of them come home and then kill themselves. And it's been a terrible war in that sense that we have really worn out our troops without really understanding what we're doing. We've never had a war this long. That's really what we're dealing with, is a whole different genre of war.
Congressman Jim McDermott is my guest. We're at 206-543-5869, 800-289-5869, or write to us, conversation@kuow.org. Let's go to South Lake Union, where we've got John on the line. John, what's your question for the congressman?
Hi, yeah. I was a development worker with USAID and a contractor for state in Afghanistan for 2.5 years. And as far as I can tell, the foreigner hatred that Mr. McDermott seems to be referencing, that didn't seem to be a huge factor. Neither did, to a lesser, also the ethnic separatism and division. So also that seemed to be a factor. And what seemed to be the major factor to me was the ruthless corruption of the Afghan government, combined with a determination on a significant part of the Pakistani military-industrial complex to reconquer Afghanistan through their Taliban proxies. And I don't see either of those things being addressed on the debate we're having about Afghanistan, and I wonder
Well, that's a good question, John.
Whether Mr. McDermott has something to say on that.
Yeah, that's come up at the highest levels of the Afghan government. In fact, a relative of the president, rumors of being involved in drug dealing. Is there anything the United States has been able to effectively do about that, and more importantly, can do about that?
I think your caller, John, brings up another series of problems that we have not dealt with. We installed Hamid Karzai. He was a consultant for California Oil Company when they were trying to bring the pipeline down through the country. We paid him $600,000 as a consultant. Well, we put him in there and said, now you're going to be our leader. He was never popularly elected. He is a man who has installed his family all over the place, even down in Kandahar province in the south. And they're corrupt. The corruption is unbelievable. And the fact that we've put all this money in, where are the bridges? Where are the schools? Where are the things that we said we were going to do for them? And the fact is that we are trying to impose on a culture, our way of thinking, and it simply is not going to happen at the rate we want it to.
John, thanks for your phone call. We've got Sarah on the line in Kingston. We were talking a little bit earlier about some of the brain injuries these soldiers have been suffering from, and your question has to do with that, Sarah?
Yes, I've lived with brain injury for over 20 years, and I'm hearing these people on the news saying, we're going to make sure that this individual is, held accountable. And I'm going, well, if he's brain injured, how do you hold him accountable? And what about the accountability of anyone who decided he was fit to go back into a combat zone?
That's a great question, Sarah. Let's see what the congressman has to say to that. How do you deal with people who are suffering from these brain injuries, if they do, particularly if they commit egregious crimes like this man is alleged to have committed?
Well, that's going to be part of the defense, I suspect, for what happens here. There's a woman who says she lived with somebody for 20 years. People who've had these experiences and have lost abilities because of having their head smashed around in their helmet or in a turnover of a vehicle or whatever, and then they come back and they can't remember their phone number and they can't remember their address, and they get lost in the neighborhood, and if you suddenly say, we're going to put you back in your military unit, and because you're in this unit, they'll kind of control you, well, at some point, somebody like that's going to get in trouble. And so there has to be a very careful screening of what the real damage was to people's brains. And we know now more than we did when I was in the Vietnam War. When I was dealing with casualties then, we didn't know near as much as we know because of MRIs and all these kinds of things. We have got to bring that technology to effect to select and keep people back. We have to admit the fact that this person cannot return to combat because he or she does not have their full faculties.
Congressman, you're a senior member of the Ways and Means Committee and writes the tax laws. Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner said this week he wants to bring down the corporate tax rate to an average of our major competitors. Business and Republicans want the corporate tax rate reduced from 35% to 25%. You've said there might be some kind of a deal this year. Is that what the deal should be? Should the corporate tax rate be reduced?
Well, I really think there ought to be a individual and corporate tax reform bill. You can't do one without the other. If you're going to reduce the taxes on business, where is the money from the government going to come from? It's going to come off individuals. So there has to be some adjustment in both areas if you're going to be serious and fair to the American people. To simply reduce the taxes on business, the taxes are about where they were with Mr. Clinton when things were rolling like a, bat out of hell, for heaven's sakes. And now we're saying if we don't bring them down, we can't be competitive.
Well, as you know, that's what critics are saying of the tax rate. They say that it's much higher here than it is in other countries. That's bad for American business. Do you buy that?
No. I think American businesses can compete. They would like to have a lower tax rate. I mean, you're never going to find anybody come and say, I want my taxes raised. I mean, when you get somebody on your show who does that, you've got a strange bird.
Well, you'd be surprised. Some people have called the show to say that they would pay higher taxes.
They've called in,
yes,
but they haven't been on the show.
Right. Congressman Jim McDermott is with us. We're approaching 12:34, and each day, Congressman, we ask people to take a picture at 12:34 during the show and post it to our website. In fact, we've got a little reward for the best photo today, The Science of Yoga, a book, the author of which we interviewed recently. Do you mind if I take a snapshot of you?
I can't put my tie up before you do it.
Okay, you can put your tie up if you'd like to. All right, we'll get the informal Jim McDermott. Very good. Okay, take your snapshot. Put it on our Facebook page, KUOW is the conversation. Email it to us, conversation@kuow.org, or tweet it with the hashtag KUOW1234. Democratic Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon has joined forces with Republican House Budget Chair Paul Ryan, a Republican, in proposing giving seniors a choice between Medicare and going with private insurance instead. Is this a step forward?
No, it's a step backward. The Medicare program is working very well, and it can be adjusted. And to suddenly throw senior citizens into choosing between private insurance and the government program is to add a layer of complexity they don't need. What older people want is certainty. They want to know it's going to be there when they need it. And when you start dealing with the insurance industry, you do not know what you have. And that's the reason why, that's why Congress put Medicare together in the first place, was because the private insurance industry wasn't doing it. And now they come along and say, well, we want to pick off those who aren't sick. We'll be glad to take care of the non-sick elderly. But the folks that are getting sick, and the older you get, the more your wheels fall off, the more you have the desire to know what you've got. And getting the private sector in there is not going to be good for senior citizens. There's no question about it.
There's been a lot written and said about how partisan Congress is now, how it's really impossible to get things done. You don't sound like you like this particular proposal, but it is encouraging to hear that a Democrat could work with a Republican. Have you had any success doing that? Have you been able to put forward any initiatives with the support of fellow Republicans in Congress?
Actually, I did. This state has a waiver for the use of foster care money for children in this state because Jeff Davis and I, on the Ways and Means Committee, we passed a bill through granting waiver authority to the Department of Health and Human Services for all states. Any governor who wants to use the money in a creative way can use it because we passed this bill. We got it through without a vote in the House and a vote in the Senate. And the interesting thing about it is that this is a nonpartisan issue. I did it 2 years ago with a similar bill. If you find issues where you can work with a Republican, you work with them. And I do it all the time. But some of these big issues become such political footballs that it's very hard.
Congressman, 12 terms in Congress, that's a lot of cross-country flights. Do you still like your job?
I just got my 3 million mile card from United. Yeah, I believe, as John McCormick once said, if you come up on the Hill and you look at the dome and you're not excited, you've either been here too long or you never should have been here in the first place. And I look forward to this next session particularly because 2013 is going to be after the Supreme Court makes its decision on health care, and we are going to be doing the final implementation before it goes into effect in 2014. I can't imagine a more exciting year to be in Congress in terms of a national sales issue.
Or a depressing year if the Supreme Court goes the other way on that.
They're not going to go the other way.
You don't think so?
No.
All right.
I would almost bet on it.
Great. We'll have you back to talk about that. Congressman Jim McDermott, thank you so much for taking the time. We appreciate you being with us.
My pleasure, Russ.
You're listening to KUOW 94.9 Seattle. I'm Ross Reynolds.